So last time we have discussed the external authorities where the I gives its obedience and therefore sometimes his own moral principles are subject to these external authorities. Now, these are called external precisely because it is outside the I, and more often than not, they are governed by authoritative figures. Now let's move to the senses of the self, which could be considered as internal authority. Internal precisely because it is within the I, it is within the self, it is within you. So first we have subjectivism. The starting point of subjectivism is the recognition that the individual thinking person or the subject is at the heart of all moral valuations. So he is the one who is confronted with the situation and is burdened with the need to make a decision or judgment. So from this point, subjectivism leaps to the more radical claim that the individual is the sole determinant of what is morally good or bad, right or wrong. So I presented here a number of cliches which could be familiar for us to comprehend this idea of subjectivism. You might have used this one way or another, or you might have heard this from someone. So, first cliche, we have no one can tell me what is right and wrong. Second, no one knows my situation better than myself. Walang nakakaalam kundi ako. Next, we have I am entitled to my own opinion. Relevant yan ngayon kasi lumalabas yung katagang respect my opinion. And lastly, we have it is good if I say that it is good, which is the central of this subjectivism. Now, there are problems of subjectivism. So, despite the immediate impression of personal independence, a closer look at these statements would reveal the problems of subjectivism. So, let's go with the first one. No one can tell me what is right and wrong. So, in a sense, it appears to be valid. Precisely, no one can compel another person to accept a certain valid judgment if he himself does not concur with it. However, we know that this statement cannot be taken as absolute because we realize in many instances that we had maintained an idea or an opinion that further discussion reveals it was actually erroneous. So we realize that we can be mistaken and that we can be corrected by others. For those of you who might have had a previous belief that now, as you are becoming an adult, have thought to be erroneous. There might be instances where you realize that the things that you were taught to be correct before are actually erroneous. Next, we have no one knows my situation better than myself. Again, it appears to be valid. In Tagalog, we have walang nakakaranas nitong, ako lang yung nakakaranas nito, so ako lang may alam nito. Or experience ko ito, karanasan ko ito, so ako lang may karapatang magsabi tungkol dito. or magdesisyon tungkol dito. So this particular person who is put in a certain situation which calls for a decision has knowledge of the factors that affect his situation and decision. But to take this fact as a ground for not listening to others is to have a mentality that imagines that no one's situation is not so personal and unique that there is no way another person can possibly understand him and give him any meaningful advice. I just changed the sense of the sentence, no? But let's read it again. To take this fact as a ground for not listening to others is to have a mentality that imagines that one's own situation or concern is so personal and unique that there is no way another person can possibly understand him and give him any meaningful advice. In other words, kaya nga mas lumalapit ang mga bata sa mga nakakatanda kasi sila yung mas may alam. And to have a mentality na walang nakakaalam ng sitwasyon mo maliban sa sarili mo, parang arrogante, no? Arrogante kasi parang sinasabi mo na walang pwedeng magbigay sa'yo ng advice. For example, teenage pregnancy. Siguro naman yung nanay mo naranasan niyang pregnancy at least. Hindi man yung teenage pregnancy but yung pregnancy mismo. So she might have some meaningful advice for you as a mother. Next, I am entitled to my own opinion. Again, it appears to be valid. But again, sometimes this is the most common misused phrase. So certainly each person has the right to believe what he believes and has the right to express this. But this right is often stubbornly misconstrued as some kind of immunity from criticism and correction. So a bigoted racist has an opinion against anyone who is dark-skinned. An anti-Semite has an opinion against Jews. And a misogynist has an opinion against women. So we realize that these opinions are highly problematic because there's no basis for considering any of these groups of people as inferior. Especially those are racist people. No? They only say that Negroes, no? or the black people are inferior because of their skin. So technically, there's no basis for their beliefs. That's why this cliche is highly problematic. So a further example would show us, would light us, would give us clarity for this cliche. So an employer who pays his female employees less than the male employees simply because he is of the opinion that women are inferior to men. Is this right or wrong? But he is entitled to his opinion, to his own opinion, right? Is he not? So to insist on one's right into having opinions, whatever this happen to be, is to exhibit a close-mindedness that rightly invites censure from someone trying to think more critically about the values. So in other words, you might be entitled to your own opinion, but that does not mean that your opinion is right. Because to have no one or rather to let to not let anyone change your own opinion is again a sign of close-mindedness. That's the problem of subjectivism. Now, let's go to the core problem of subjectivism, which is reflected on the cliche, it is good if I say that it is good. So the statement implies it is my personal consideration of X as good that makes X good. X is good on the basis of my saying so. So the problem now becomes, what is my basis for saying X is good? It takes the fact that I am the subject making the valuation and uses this fact as the very basis for that valuation. But when I, as a subject, am asking what is right or wrong, good or bad, with subjectivism, there is no other basis that I can look toward to. In other words, for example, when you ask someone who is a misogynist, and you ask them why they hate women in authority, more often than not, they would only say, "This is my opinion," or more often than not, they would just say, "This is my belief. I just believe that blah blah blah." In other words, when they try to provide a basis, they only refer to the subject, no, to the I speaking that valuation. So in other words, there's no really other basis that they can look toward to. So that's the problem of subjectivism. Let's move now to the second sense of the self, which could be a hindrance to ethical valuation. We have psychological egoism. Again, let's consider another cliche for us to understand this concept. So, this cliche states that human beings are naturally self centered, so all our actions are always already motivated by self interest. Always already. Meaning to say, without you having to decide it, without you having to think about it, no? There is always already a motivation for self interest. So, this is the stance taken by psychological egoism, which is a theory that describes the underlying dynamic behind human actions. But as a descriptive theory, it does not direct one to act in any particular way. It just describes what could be the case. So instead, it points out that there is already an underlying basis for how one should act. So the ego or self has its own desires and interests. And all our actions are geared towards satisfying these interests. Now, what's the problematic consequence of psychological egoism? So consider this scenario. So one woman spends her money on expensive clothes and another donates to charity. So in terms of psychological egoism, they are both simply and equally doing what is self-serving for themselves, because they both are simply fulfilling what would serve them. They are of equal moral worth. So, in judging these persons and these actions, we can ask ourselves, do we want to give up on our moral intuition concerning the goodness and the value of generosity versus the wrongness of selfishness just for the sake of this duty? So, most significantly, turning to the next consequence, when we move from moral judgment to moral decision, the question is, how then are we supposed to decide? So, according to psychological egoism, it would not matter, precisely because there is always already a determined self interest that you would like to serve. So, whatever your intention could be, psychological egoism will dictate that you are only serving your self interest. For example, a simple act of kindness, just like giving change to the poor, no matter how little the worth is, you are, according to psychological egoism, serving your self interest of feeling satisfied of helping other people. So we only think that we have a choice, but actually, whatever way that we end up acting, our minds have already actually determined what serves our interest best. So in other words, walang lusot sa psychological egoism according to this theory. Again, it's just a theory. Walang lusot ang intention. Walang lusot ang moral worth. Kasi whatever the case may be, no matter how good your intention is, no matter how good your result is, according to psychological egoism, you're only doing that action precisely because at the end of the day, it would serve your best interest. Sa psychology, we also have this term altruism, yung selfless act of kindness. When looking at this psychological egoism, altruism is not possible. Um, like my example a while ago, just a simple act of kindness, like giving money to the poor, is always already motivated by your self-interest of feeling satisfied. Yung man lang mabalik sa yung pakiramdam na magaan. According to psychological egoism, that is already self-interest. Kumbaga, dahil ayaw mong maramdaman na makonsensya ka or makokonsensya ka, tutulong ka na lang. So yung pag-iwas mo sa pagranas mo ng konsensya is according to psychological egoism, an always already motivation in your part. So lastly, we have ethical egoism. So ethical egoism differs from psychological egoism in that it does not suppose all our actions as always already inevitably self-serving. So instead, ethical egoism prescribes that we should make our own ends, our own interests as the single overriding concern. So we may act in a way that is beneficial to others, but we should do that only if it ultimately benefits us. So this theory acknowledges that it is a dog eat dog world out there. And given that, everyone ought to put himself at the center. So one should consider himself as the priority and not allow any other concerns, such as the welfare of other people, to detract from this pursuit. So the difference lies in the self-serving motivation. So according to psychological egoism, kahit ano man yung intention mo, no, meron ka pa ring self-interest. Ethical egoism, on the other hand, prescribes. Hindi niya sinusuppose na meron ng motivation, but it provokes us, no? Prescribes us that we should make our own self-interest. So you only do a thing, a good thing at that, precisely because at the end of the day, it will ultimately benefit us. So, for example, yung wearing of mask, no? Um, when you wear a mask, you think of yourself, right? But actually, yung ethical action doon would be you also protect other people by wearing your mask. Because kung ikaw yung may virus, at least hindi mo mahahawaan yung ibang tao. So, the problem of ethical egoism, it is clear that we have our interests and desires and would want them satisfied. Thus, this question can be asked, why should I have any concern about the interests of others? So in a sense, this question challenges in a fundamental way the idea of not just a study of ethics, but also the effort of being ethical. Why not just look after one's own self? So that's the problem. No? That's the problem of ethical egoism because it actually allows us, no, prescribes us that we should make our actions as self-serving. So these three, no, these three senses of the self could be hindrances to making ethical decision and ethical judgment and valuation, precisely because it misses the point of the reason why you should do a good action. If these three are self-serving, then technically it would not be ethical. Because in ethics, we should also be concerned with the life and the well-being of other people, which is, I think, the common good of all countries, especially here in the Philippines. So that ends our lecture for the senses of the self, which could be hindrances to ethical valuation. So we have done external authority and internal authority. Thank you for listening.